always very nervous before going live because we do not really know what is going to happen.
Yeah, I bet.
Yeah, we are live. It
Okay.
says, I'll just check. Okay, we are live. Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Carvan. I'm Ishan Sharma. And with me, I have a very special guest this evening to talk about a very interesting theme, something that interests me and many uh, people who study history about various narratives of our epics. And today we are going to talk about and listen to Professor Sara Pillai, Sohini Sara Pillai, I'm really sorry, on the multiplicity of the Mahabharata tradition. She is an assistant professor of religion at Kalamazoo College, and where she teaches courses on religious traditions in South Asia. She is a comparatist of South Asian religious literature, and her area of specialization is the Mahabharata and the Ramayana epic. Today, we'll discover rather various narrative traditions of Mahabharata, the epic that we all are familiar with. And she has recently published a book, Many Mahabharata. State University of New York Press has published it. And we look forward to this talk very eagerly. So, without further ado, welcome, Dr. Pillai, and thank you so much for accepting our invitation.
Thank you so much. Let me just share my screen.
Yeah, and those who are joining us, you can send your questions to Dr. Pillai through the YouTube live chat, which I'll be reading towards the end. And we might have a good discussion on the lecture post this presentation. Over to you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ishan. So, and you can see the screen. Can I just confirm that? Okay,
Yes.
great. So I would like to begin by thanking Ishan Sharma and everyone at Karwan, the Heritage Exploration Initiative, for inviting me to give an online lecture today. I have been an admirer of this independent student-led initiative for quite some time now, and I am in awe of all the work that Ishan and his colleagues at Karwan have done to make South Asian history and culture more accessible to a larger audience, especially during this global COVID-19 pandemic. So last month, I was delighted to see that the November 2021 edition of the Caravan magazine was dedicated to the diversity of the Ramayana narrative tradition, with a special focus on Ramayanas that challenge dominant discourses. The titles of essays in this Caravan issue include Ethnic Histories of Ram and Krishna, The Demonization of Kaikeyi and Shurpanakha, Ravan Was a Gond King, and the many Muslim versions of the Ramayana. The words Many Ramayanas on the cover of this Caravan issue also invoke a pioneering edited volume. 30 years ago, in 1991, the University of California Press published a collection of essays edited by Paula Richman that was entitled Many Ramayanas, The Diversity of a Narrative Tradition in South Asia. Today, Many Ramayanas remains a seminal piece of scholarship in the field of South Asian studies. The Ramayanas that readers are introduced to in this volume range from the Buddhist text, the Dasharatha Jataka, which was produced around the 2nd century BCE in Pali, to Tulsidas's immensely popular 16th century Bhasha or Old Hindi poem, the Ramcharitmanas, to women's folk songs in Telugu in contemporary South India. For many students of South Asian literature, religion, and culture and history, Many Ramayanas was what ignited their interest in the field. Two of these students were myself and my friend and colleague, Nell Shapiro-Hawley, who is currently a PhD candidate in South Asian languages and civilizations at the University of Chicago, as well as preceptor in Sanskrit at Harvard University. Although Nell and I are both very fond of the Ramayana tradition, each of our current research projects center on the other great epic narrative tradition of South Asia, the Mahabharata. While Nell studies the Sanskrit Mahabharata and its early iterations in Sanskrit poetry and drama, my current book project focuses on pre-modern Mahabharata retellings composed in the regional South Asian languages of Tamil and Bhasha, or Old Hindi. In order to demonstrate that the Mahabharata tradition is as broad, diverse, and compelling as its Ramayana counterpart, 5 years ago in 2016, Nell and I embarked on a project that would eventually become Many Mahabharatas. Many Mahabharatas is a collection of 18 essays that introduce readers to Mahabharatas created in 10 different languages in the forms of classical dramas, pre-modern vernacular poems, regional performance traditions, literary commentaries, political essays, short stories, contemporary theater productions, and graphic novels. Many Mahabharatas was published by State University of New York, or SUNY Press, in May of this year. And I'm also very happy to share that the Indian edition of Many Mahabharatas is on track to be released from Primus Books in Delhi in 2022. So my talk today is not on the book Many Mahabharatas itself, but it does deal with one of the major themes of the volume, the multiplicity of the Mahabharata tradition. In order to illustrate this rich multiplicity, my presentation will examine 12 different renderings of a single Mahabharata episode that was created over a span of at least 2,000 years. The episode I will focus on today is the attempted disrobing of Draupadi, which is popularly known in Hindi as Draupadi ka Vastraharan or Draupadi ka Chirharan. In this lecture, I will reveal how different individuals and communities have used the disrobing of Draupadi episode to pursue diverse religious, social, and political goals at various points in South Asian history. The scene in which the Kaurava prince Dushasana viciously drags the menstruating shared wife of the Pandavas by her hair and then tries to publicly disrobe her after the eldest Pandava brother Yudhishthira gambles and loses her in a crooked game of dice is one of the most disturbing and popular scenes in the Mahabharata tradition. In several different Mahabharatas, including this painting by Rajashree Manikandan in the style of Chitrakati picture storytelling tradition that was once practiced in Maharashtra, Karnataka, and Andhra Pradesh, that's on your screen, Draupadi calls out to the Hindu god Krishna when Dushasana begins to pull at her garment, and the deity answers her prayer by beginning to provide her with a never-ending stream of cloth. For all its fame in people's minds throughout India today, however, the sequence with Draupadi's prayer and Krishna's divine intervention is noticeably absent in the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. The ancient Sanskrit Mahabharata, which is traditionally attributed to the sage Vyasa, was likely compiled over a period of roughly 600 years between 300 BCE and 300 CE. But the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata was constructed in the 20th century of this era at the Bhandarkar Oriental Research Institute in Pune under the direction of B.S. Suktankar. And as Emily Hudson explains, the oldest extant manuscripts of the Mahabharata date from the medieval period, after the formation of two major extant recensions, the northern and southern. The critical edition is the result of the collation of a large number of manuscripts from both of these recensions. The aim of the editors of the critical edition was to recreate what they considered to be the ancestor of all the manuscripts that they examined and collated, a goal that in the end they could only approximate. So that is how the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata was constructed. And here is Alf Hiltebeidel's translation of the moment in the dicing episode in the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, during which Dushasana attempts to disrobe Draupadi. Then Dushasana, O king, forcibly tore off Draupadi's garment in the middle of the sabha and began to undress her. But whenever one of Draupadi's garments was removed, O king, another garment like it repeatedly appeared. Then there was a shout of approval there, a terrible roar from all the kings, having watched that greatest wonder in the world. As is the case in this 18th century painting from the Punjab hills, Krishna is nowhere to be seen in the disrobing of Draupadi scene in the critical edition of the Mahabharata. Multiple scholars have labeled Krishna's presence in this episode in the Sanskrit epic a late bhakti or devotional interpolation. Wendy Doniger notes that the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata assumes that the power of Draupadi's own dharma, her unwavering devotion to her husbands, is what protects her when Dushasana tries to strip her. Doniger adds that several manuscripts of this passage, as well as many texts composed after the 10th century, remove Draupadi's agency by saying that she called for help from Krishna, who arrived and performed the miracle of the expanding sari. There's a real loss of feminist ground here. So that is Wendy Doniger's take on this. But we cannot ignore that Draupadi's prayer to Krishna is an intrinsic part of the dice game episode in the larger Mahabharata narrative tradition. Like I said, this is a sequence in the Mahabharata that everyone remembers. If you ask anyone in India how was Draupadi saved, most of them will say that it was Krishna who came and rescued her. On your screens, we have another painting from the Punjab hills of Draupadi's disrobing from roughly the same time period as the painting we just saw on the previous slide. But in this painting, Krishna is clearly present in the disrobing scene. While absent from the critical edition, Draupadi's call to Krishna is found in both the northern and southern recensions of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. One of the most popular editions of the Sanskrit Mahabharata today is the edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata that was produced by Nilakanta Chaturdhara. This version of the Sanskrit Mahabharata is commonly referred to as the Vulgate Mahabharata, and Vulgate means popular, so that's why it has gained this title of the Vulgate Mahabharata, not vulgar, but popular. So Nilakanta was a 17th century Brahmin scholar from present-day Maharashtra who was based in Benares, and his edition of the text contains the most well-known and only complete extant commentary on the Sanskrit Mahabharata, the Bharata Bhavadipa. So Nilakanta's Vulgate Mahabharata is generally identified with the northern recension of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. As I said earlier, there's a southern and a northern recension. And here is Vishal Sharma's lovely translation from the Vulgate Sanskrit Mahabharata. When her clothes were being dragged off, Draupadi thought about Hari. O Govinda, resident of Dwarka, O Krishna, beloved of the cowherdesses, don't you know that I have been abused by the Kauravas, Keshava? O Master, Master of Rama, Lord of Vraja, one who removes suffering, rescue me as I'm sunk in the ocean of the Kauravas, Janardana. Krishna, Krishna, great yogi, self of the world, creator of the world. Protect me who has taken refuge in you, Govinda, suffering in the midst of the Kurus. Having heard Yajnaseni's words, Krishna became absorbed. He left his throne and with compassion, the merciful one arrived on foot. This episode in the Vulgate edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata is overflowing with bhakti or devotion to Krishna. Stories of Krishna's childhood deeds, such as his slaying of the demoness Putana, his romantic dalliances with the cowherdesses or gopis of his village, and his lifting of Mount Govardhana are largely absent from the Sanskrit Mahabharata. In the scene in the Vulgate edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, however, Draupadi alludes in her prayer to story of Krishna's childhood among the cowherds of Vrindavan with the use of epithets such as Govinda, protector of cows, Gopi Janapriya, beloved of the gopis, and Vrajanatha, lord of Braj. Detailed accounts of this deity's adolescence are first found in well-known Krishna-centric Sanskrit works such as the Harivamsha, the Vishnu Purana, and the Bhagavata Purana. Story of Krishna's youth are also found throughout the Tamil Divya Prabandham, the collected poems of the 12 Tamil Bhakti poets known as the Alvars, who likely lived between the 6th and 9th centuries of the Common Era. By the 12th century, the Tamil Divya Prabandham was revered as the Tamil Veda by the Sri Vaishnava Hindu religious community in South India. One of the most famous members of the Alvars is a 9th century poet, Tirumangai Alvar. Tirumangai Alvar is the author of 6 different compositions in the Divya Prabandham, including a massive poem called the Periya Tirumori, or the Grand Divine Speech. In one verse of the Periya Tirumori, Tirumangai Alvar sings of how Krishna saved Draupadi in the assembly hall. As the younger brother of the King of Kings, the son of the blind one, went to the one with jeweled ornaments and said, "Be our slave," Krishna removed the wedding threads obtained by the old women of the 100, giving them the sorrow of the one with hair the color of night who could not endure, and said, "Our Lord, compassion." I saw him, the one who stood at the front of the chariot of the son of Indra in Tiruvalikeni. In this verse, Tirumangai Alvar tells us that Krishna used the entire Kurukshetra war between the Pandavas and the Kauravas to avenge Draupadi's humiliation at the hands of Dushasana. At the end of the verse, Tirumangai Alvar describes Krishna as the one who stood at the front of the chariot of the son of Indra, i.e., the middle Pandava prince Arjuna, and as the one he saw in Tiruvalikeni. Tiruvalikeni in modern-day Chennai is the home of the Parthasarathi temple. Parthasarathi means the charioteer of Partha or Arjuna, and this epithet is clearly referring to Krishna's role as Arjuna's charioteer during the battle of Kurukshetra in the Mahabharata. This temple in Tiruvallikeni is also one of the 108 Divya Deshams, or divine places in the Sri Vaishnava religious tradition. Thus, with this verse, Tirumangai Alvar connects Krishna from the Mahabharata to a more local and regional sacred South Indian Sri Vaishnava geography. And it's also worth noting that Tirumangai Alvar is by no means the only bhakti poet who speaks of Draupadi's prayer to Krishna. He's joined by many beloved Hindu devotional poets, including Tukaram in Marathi, Kanakadasa in Kannada, and Surdas, Mirabai, and Tulsidas in Bhasha or Old Hindi. Approximately 100 years after Tirumangai Alvar was active in a different part of South India, a Kannada Mahabharata called the Vikram Arjuna Vijayam, or the Victory of Heroic Arjuna, was composed by a poet by the name of Pampa, who was a Digambara Jain. So there is a robust Jain Mahabharata tradition that is comprised of texts in multiple different languages, including Sanskrit, Prakrit, Apabhramsha, Kannada, and Bhasha. Beginning in the 8th century with Jinnasena Punata's Sanskrit Harivamsha Purana, several Jain poets started to incorporate stories about the Pandavas into poems that narrate the lives of Krishna and his cousin Neminatha, who is the 22nd of the Tirthankaras, the founders of the Jain faith. And it's important to make clear that the Krishna of Hindu literary traditions is very different from the Krishna of Jain literary traditions. In Jain literature, there are 9 triads of figures, and each triad is composed of a Baladeva, a Vasudeva, and a Prativasudeva. Gregory Kleins explains that the Baladevas are men who are strict Jains, who even in trying circumstances epitomize a commitment to the tenet of nonviolence or ahimsa, and that the half-brothers of the Baladevas are the Vasudevas. These men are warriors who slay their primary enemies, the Prativasudevas. They do not uphold the tenet of nonviolence like the Baladevas, and consequently must spend time in hell before eventually being reborn. Krishna is the 9th Vasudeva, and he behaves rather deviously with his cousin Neminatha. Many of the Jain texts listed on this slide are centered on the deeds of Neminatha and Krishna and only dedicate a bit of space to the Pandavas. But this is not the case with Pampa's Vikram Arjuna Vijayam. The lives of Neminatha and his cousin Krishna are not the focus of this Kannada poem. Instead, the plot of the Vikram Arjuna Vijayam resembles that of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. In fact, in the beginning of his text, Pampa directly pays tribute to Vyasa, the traditional author of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. And here are the lines translated by Sarah Pierce Taylor. I will swim in the nectar ocean of rich speech of that great sage Vyasa, but I'm not so arrogant as to say I am the poet Vyasa. Yet, although the Vikram Arjuna Vijayam, or the Pampa Bharatam, as it's more commonly referred to, although it generally follows the story of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, there are still some significant differences between Pampa's Kannada work and the Sanskrit epic attributed to Vyasa. One is that Pampa's composition focuses on just one of the 5 Pandava brothers. As the title suggests, Arjuna is the hero of the Vikram Arjuna Vijayam. In his Kannada text, Pampa directly compares his patron, Arikesari II of the Chalukya Empire, who reigned from around 930 to 955 CE, to Arjuna. Another major difference is likely connected to Pampa's religious identity as a member of the Digambara Jain community. In Pampa's Vikram Arjuna Vijayam, Draupadi is only married to Arjuna and not all 5 of the Pandava brothers, as she is in the Sanskrit Mahabharata and many, many other Mahabharatas. Jonathan Geen explains that Mahabharatas composed by Digambara Jain poets insist that Draupadi married Arjuna alone, and that the rumor of her marriage to 5 men must be considered absurd, scandalous, and unequivocally false. When we look at the dice game in the Vikram Arjuna Vijayam, we find another major difference. Kambalur Venkatesa Acharya reports that Pampa does not allow Dushasana to strip off the sari of Draupadi in this text. And he adds that since Pampa has not allowed his Dushasana to strip off the sari of Draupadi, he has not found any need to bring in the divine grace of Krishna to save her from this brutal assault. V.R. Nagaraj asserts that elsewhere in the Vikramarjuna Vijayam, since Krishna cannot be accepted as a god by Jains, Pampa transforms the religious associations of the Sanskrit epic into purely aesthetic ones. Is Pampa's decision to omit Dushasana attempting to disrobe Draupadi and Draupadi's prayer to Krishna also related to the poet's identity as a Digambara Jain? Let me now turn to the depiction of Draupadi's attempted disrobing in the 15th century Tamil Bharatam of Villiputturar, who I will henceforth refer to as Villi. Villi's Tamil Bharatam is one of the two pre-modern regional Mahabharata retellings that are at the heart of my current book project, which is tentatively titled Krishna at Court, Devotion, Patronage, and the Mahabharata in Pre-Modern South Asia. Villi's Bharatam has been labeled a work of courtly literature because of multiple references to a local chieftain named Varapati Atkondan in the text. A closer look at this Tamil Mahabharata, however, reveals that this courtly text is also imbibed with a markedly Sri Vaishnava Bhakti ethos. Just take Villi's rendering of the disrobing scene. As Dushasana prepares to strip Draupadi after Yudhishthira loses her in the dice game, Draupadi joins her hands together and thinks of M. Peruman, our Lord. Notably, Draupadi uses this exact same name when she calls out to Krishna in the verse of Tirumangai Alvar's Pere Tirumori that we examined earlier. Villi, who is remembered today in Tamil Nadu as Villiputtur Alvar or Villi the Alvar, utilizes many of the same epithets and tropes found in the Divya Prabandham, which again is the collected works of the Alvars that is an important text for Sri Vaishnavas. Villi presents Draupadi's prayer to Krishna in a single beautiful verse. Forming a river from her two wide eyes with kohl, hot tears of water fell. Her hair fell. Her hands tired from holding that cloth fell. Her consciousness fell. Then, without saying a single word, she cried out, Govinda, Govinda. And nectar flowed on her cooled tongue that had not flowed before. The hair on her body stood on end and her whole heart completely melted. Draupadi's bodily response in the scene in the Bharatam makes it clear that she's engaging in prapatti or sharanagati, self-surrender, which is a paramount concept in the Sri Vaishnava tradition. For several prominent Sri Vaishnava preceptors and commentators, such as Peryavachan Pillai, Pillai Lokacharya, and Manabalama Muni, Draupadi's call to Krishna is a prime example of prapatti. Villi shows us that Draupadi's entire being is literally surrendering to Krishna. Her tears, hair, hands, and indeed her very consciousness all fall away. And after Draupadi calls out to Govinda, her body is instantly rewarded for her prapatti. Villi describes Draupadi entering a state of rapture in ways that would be instantly recognized by audiences familiar with Bhakti literature across South Asia, the nectar on the tongue and the horripilation, goosebumps on the skin being cases in point. But Villi's particular language for what happens to Draupadi is somewhat more specific. His description of melting, what happens to the devotee's heart in the presence of the divine, would have been deeply familiar to Sri Vaishnava Tamil listeners. It is repeatedly utilized by the Alvars. We also see this trope in the work of renowned Tamil Shaiva Bhakti poets such as Karikalammayar, Sambandar, and Manika Basakar. Thus, Villi presents a depiction of Draupadi's prayer to Krishna that is anchored in the embodied experience of prapatti, and that is full of familiar images from Tamil Bhakti poetry, especially that of the Sri Vaishnava tradition. So we've just looked at 3 examples from South India. Let's head to the north for our next Mahabharata. Between the late 16th century and the early 18th century, several South Asian poets composed Persian retellings of the Mahabharata and the Ramayana that were either commissioned by or dedicated to one of the rulers of the Mughal Empire. And let me quickly just share a few examples. In 1594, Akbar's poet laureate Faizi composed a Persian Masnavi, which is a lengthy narrative poem in rhymed couplets based on the story of Nala and Damayanti from the Mahabharata tradition entitled Nal Daman. Akbar commissioned a Persian translation of Valmiki's Sanskrit Ramayana, and one of the manuscripts of the Akbari Ramayana was owned by both Akbar's mother, Hamida Banu Begum, and Akbar's son, Jahangir. Goda Abhinanda's 10th century Sanskrit Laghu Yoga Vashishta is a Ramayana retelling that was repeatedly translated into Persian under the patronage of multiple members of the Mughal royal family, including Akbar, Jahangir, and Jahangir's grandson, Dara Shikoh. There are 2 different early 17th century Persian Ramayana retellings that are dedicated to Jahangir, Masi Panipati's Masnavi Ram Vasita and Giridhar Das's Ram Nama. Dara Shikoh is credited with being the patron of a Persian translation of the Bhagavad-Gita, and there are 2 more Persian Ramayanas that are dedicated to Dara Shikoh's younger brother, Aurangzeb, Chandraman Bedal's 17th century Nargistan and Amar Singh's 18th century Amar Prakash. But perhaps the most famous of these Persian epic retellings is the Razamnama, or Book of War. The Razamnama is a Persian translation of the Sanskrit Mahabharata that was commissioned in 1582 by Akbar. In order to create the Razamnama, Akbar gathered a group of Hindu Brahmin scholars who would read from the northern recension of the Sanskrit Mahabharata and then explain the narrative in Bhasha or Old Hindi to a group of Persian literati who then wrote down what they heard in Persian. Najaf Haider reports that the Razamnama commences with praise of the elephant-headed Hindu deity Ganesha rather than the traditional Islamic formula of invoking Allah or Bismillah. But as the Razamnama continues, Audrey Trushke observes that the poem repeatedly refers to a monotheistic Islamic deity who sometimes replaces Hindu gods, but more commonly appears alongside them. She elaborates that Mughal thinkers introduced Allah, both using that term and others, into the Mahabharata in order to acculturate the epic for a predominantly Muslim audience. So how is the disrobing of Draupadi presented in the Razamnama? I was curious to see whether we find Draupadi's prayer to Krishna in this text, given how other scenes with Krishna are depicted in the Razamnama. Take one of the most famous Krishna-centric sections of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, the Bhagavad-Gita. Trushke asserts that while for the most part Islamic and Hindu traditions comfortably coexist in the Razamnama, the Mughals indicate discomfort with the perceived Hindu message of the Bhagavad-Gita by drastically shortening and altering the section. She adds that in comparison with the 700 or so verses in the Sanskrit, the Bhagavad-Gita occupies a mere few pages of the Razamnama. Now, I cannot read Persian, but Audrey Trushke very kindly examined the dicing episode in the Razamnama for me. And while the Bhagavad Gita might be truncated in the Razamnama, the creators of this Mughal Mahabharata include Draupadi's prayer to Krishna in their rendering of the dicing episode. This is fascinating, and I hope that this part of the Razamnama will be explored in more detail by Persian scholars in the future. I now want to turn to another Mahabharata that, like the Razamnama, could be classified as a Mughal Mahabharata. But unlike the Razamnama, this Mahabharata is not in Persian, but in Bhasha or Old Hindi. Sabal Singh Chauhan's 17th century Bhasha Mahabharata is the Mahabharata retelling that I analyze alongside Vili's Tamil Bharatam in my in-progress book project, Krishna at Court, Devotion, Patronage, and the Mahabharata in Pre-Modern South Asia. The Bhasha Mahabharata, like the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, is divided into 18 different books. In the prologue of his 16th book, Chauhan describes himself performing his composition before a king named Mitrasen and the 6th ruler of the Mughal Empire, Aurangzeb, in Delhi. He also praises Mitrasen in the prologue of the 7th book and Aurangzeb in the prologues of the 6th, 8th, 9th, and 17th books of the Bhasha Mahabharata. Based on these allusions and 7 of the 8 different composition dates that Chauhan gives in 8 prologues to his books being within the dates accepted as Aurangzeb's reign from 1658 to 1707 CE, multiple Hindi literary historians have argued that Chauhan and Mitrasen were Hindu Rajput nobles in the service of Aurangzeb in Delhi. Aurangzeb is easily the most controversial Mughal emperor, and he's frequently remembered in India today as a devout Muslim who violently persecuted Hindus and destroyed Hindu temples. In recent years, however, scholarship has begun to complicate this picture of Aurangzeb. My work on the praise of Aurangzeb in the Bhasha Mahabharata contributes to this body of scholarship that challenges monolithic representations of this Mughal emperor. While Chauhan's Mahabharata repeatedly extols Aurangzeb, it is also an overtly Hindu bhakti retelling of the Mahabharata. And this is clear when we take a close look at the disrobing scene. So let's examine just the first 4 lines of Draupadi's extensive 28-line long prayer to Krishna in Chauhan's Mahabharata. Radha Raman, listen to my words, she bitterly cried and lamented. Just as you, the lord of the Raghus, grasped the hands of Bharata, who is drowning in an ocean of separation, just as you saved the king of monkeys Sugriva, protected Vibhishana, and killed Ravana, when Dhruva was scorned by his mother and father, then Lord, you rescued him. Here, Draupadi begins her prayer with the word Radha Raman, or Radha's lover. Radha Raman is a form of Krishna worshipped by the Gaudiya Vaishnava community in the Radha Raman temple in Vrindavan, and we find Krishna being referred to as Radha Raman in the 16th century Bhasha compositions of Gadadhar Bhatt, a disciple of Chaitanya, and Hari Ram Vyas, a Krishna devotee who is not affiliated with a particular sectarian community. Yet, despite calling out this distinctly North Indian name of Krishna, Draupadi begins her prayer by remembering the deeds of Rama, not Krishna. Draupadi commences her plea with allusions to 4 key Ramayana characters: Bharata, Sugriva, Vibhishana, and Ravana. Why does Draupadi start her prayer to Krishna by recounting tales from his previous incarnation, Rama? If we carefully examine the rest of Chauhan's text, it soon becomes apparent that this Mahabharata is imbued with references to Rama and the Ramayana tradition. Along with placing multiple invocations in praise of Rama in the different books of his text, Chauhan inserts several episodes throughout his narrative in which Rama's greatest devotee, Hanuman, comes to Arjuna's aid. Chauhan also tells us that he composed parts of his Mahabharata on North Indian festivals dedicated to Rama, such as Vijayadashami or Dashera, the day Rama defeated Ravana. When Chauhan states that he began the book of the Assembly Hall in 1670 on the 9th day of Chaitra, or Ram Navami, Rama's birthday, he directly aligns himself with the famed Bhasha Bhakti poet Tulsidas, who says that he commenced his Ramcharitmanas on the 9th day of Chaitra in 1574. Beginning Draupadi's prayer to Krishna with allusions to Rama, is part of Chauhan's larger project of creating a Bhakti Mahabharata that resonates with devotees of Rama in North India. I'm now going to fast forward a few hundred years to 1912. In the 20th century, the Mahabharata tradition underwent a major transformation in South Asia. Several poets and playwrights writing in regional South Asian languages, including Bengali, Hindi, Marathi, and Tamil, began to use the Mahabharata as an allegory for the anti-colonial struggle against the British Raj. In these allegorical Mahabharatas, the Pandavas are presented as Indian freedom fighters and Draupadi as Mother India, while the Kauravas are depicted as the British colonizers. One of the most famous anti-colonial Mahabharatas is the poem Panchali Sabadam, or Draupadi's Vow, which was composed by the great modern Tamil poet and independence activist Subramaniam Bharati, who is more commonly referred to as Bharatiyar. Bharatiyar began to write Panchali Sabadam in 1912 while he was living in Pondicherry. Bharatiyar had escaped to French-ruled Pondicherry in 1908 to avoid being imprisoned by the British. Panchali Sabadam is comprised of 5 cantos and covers the events of the entire dicing episode from the Mahabharata tradition. When Dushasana begins to strip Draupadi in Panchali Sabadam, the shared wife of the Pandavas begins to pray to Krishna as she does in so many Mahabharatas. Bharatiyar dedicates 7 verses to Draupadi's prayer, and each verse is filled with familiar images of Vaishnava Bhakti. Bharatiyar's Draupadi praises Krishna as the one who saved the elephant king Gajendra from a crocodile, the one who danced on the head of the poisonous serpent Kalia, and the one who emerged from a pillar and rescued Prahlada from his demon father Hiranyakshipu. After Dushasana fails to disrobe Draupadi, Bharatiyar describes the gods in heaven raining flowers down on her and proclaiming Jaya Jaya Bharata Sakti, or victory, victory to the power of Bharata. While the word Bharata can refer to the Sanskrit Mahabharata or a member of the Bharata clan, in modern South Asia, Bharata or Bharat is a common synonym for the Indian nation. And at the end of Panchali Sabadam, Bharatiyar's heroine delivers her famous Sabadam or vow. And here is Usha Rajagopalan's translation of this pivotal scene. And then did Devi Draupadi speak, Om, I pledge on goddess Parashakti, the crimson blood of evil Dushasana and the blood of the most despicable Duryodhana must meet and mingle. I will smear it on my hair and then wash it off with scented oils. Only then will I comb and braid my hair. It's important to note that Draupadi's formidable vow to leave her hair unbraided until she washes it with Kaurava blood is not Bharatiyar's own invention. While Draupadi's vow is absent from the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, it does have a place in the Sanskrit drama, the Veni Samhara, or the Binding of the Braid, by Bhattanarayana, who seems to have been active in North India in the 8th century of the Common Era. Draupadi's vow is also found in multiple pre-modern South Indian Mahabharatas in Kannada, Malayalam, and Tamil, including Billy's Tamil Bharatam. In Panchali Sabadam, in which Draupadi is a representation of Mother India and the Kauravas are representations of India's colonial oppressors, Draupadi's oath to wash her hair in the blood of both Duryodhana and Dushasana is extremely powerful. 8 years after Bharatiyar began to write Panchali Sabadam, in 1920, on the other side of the Indian subcontinent, the modern Hindi poet Ramcharit Upadhyay published a composition entitled Devi Draupadi, or Goddess Draupadi. Ramcharat Upadhyay was a student of Mahavir Prasad Dwivedi, who was one of the most important figures in the world of modern Hindi literature and poetry. Like Bharatiyar's Panchali Sabadam, Upadhyay's Devi Draupadi presents the heroine of the Mahabharata as a personification of Mother India. Nowhere is this more evident than in Draupadi's prayer to Krishna in the disrobing scene in Devi Draupadi. This is Pamela Lott's speech's translation of Draupadi's plea. Lord, save my honor. You're called an ocean of compassion. You always run wherever there is injustice. India has lost her good fortune. Her king is unjust. Come, now only you can be trusted. Why do you let me cry? You are the rightful overseer and guardian of the world. That is why you punish evildoers and protect your people. You are the shelter of the homeless, the strength of the powerless. You breathe life into ashes and prop up the downtrodden. I am in grave danger. Save me and my husbands. Alas, whom do you call my savior in this world? In her analysis of this scene, Lott's speech astutely observes that Krishna seems to represent a paternalistic Gandhi figure in Devi Draupadi. She goes on to point out that Krishna miraculously causes Draupadi's garment to reduplicate in endless yards of fabric, while Gandhi, for his part, sought to encourage indigenous cloth production through boycotts and the burning of foreign-made cloth. The presentation of Krishna as Mahatma Gandhi in Upadhyay's work is thus very striking. In the final three Mahabharatas that I will discuss today, however, Krishna is noticeably absent from the disrobing scene. Let's jump in time again from the end of the colonial period to 1978, the year in which Mahasweta Devi's Bengali short story Draupadi was first published. Mahasweta Devi was a renowned author and social activist. Her short story Draupadi is set in 1971 in West Bengal. The protagonist of this story is Draupadi Medhan, a 27-year-old Adivasi woman from the Santal community in Northwest India. Draupadi was named Draupadi after the heroine of the Mahabharata by the wife of her former employer. As Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak notes in the foreword to her translation of the short story, Devi's protagonist is introduced to the reader between two uniforms and between two versions of her name, Draupadi and Draupadi. It is either that as a tribal, she cannot pronounce her own Sanskrit name Draupadi, or the tribalized form Draupadi is the proper name of the ancient Draupadi. Devi's short story is divided into three sections. In the first two sections, Devi's protagonist is almost exclusively referred to as Draupadi. In the final section, however, the Adivasi woman is mostly referred to as Draupadi. This third section of the short story begins with Draupadi being captured by the Indian army and brought before the army officer Senanayak, the clear Duryodhana of this tale. And unlike in the Sanskrit Mahabharata and the majority of the other Mahabharatas we have seen today, not only is Draupadi disrobed in this short story, she is also violently gang raped. And it is Senanayak who orders Draupadi's gang rape. But after this brutal sexual assault, Draupadi refuses to be re-robed, and she defiantly stands before Senanayak. And let me now share the final three paragraphs of Spivak's translation of Devi's Bengali short story. Draupadi's black body comes even closer. Draupadi shakes with an indomitable laughter that Senanayak simply cannot understand. Her ravaged lips bleed as she begins laughing. Draupadi wipes the blood off her palm and says in a voice that is as terrifying, sky-splitting, and sharp as her ululation, "What's the use of clothes? You can strip me, but how can you clothe me again? Are you a man?" She looks around and chooses the front of Senanayak's white bush shirt to spit a bloody gob at and says, "There isn't a man here that I should be ashamed. I will not let you put cloth on me. What more can you do? Come on, counter me. Come on, counter me." Draupadi pushes Senanayak with her two mangled breasts, and for the first time, Senanayak is afraid to stand before an unarmed target, terribly afraid. I was first introduced to this powerful short story as an undergraduate student, and this coming winter, I will have the students in my Princesses, Demonesses, and Warriors, the Women of the South Asian Epics course at Kalamazoo College, read Draupadi. English honors students at Delhi University, however, no longer have the opportunity to read and study this short story in an academic setting. On August 24th of this year, the Delhi University Academic Council dropped Mahasweta Devi's Draupadi from the BA Honors English course. And the Academic Council also dropped the work of two Tamil Dalit female authors, Bama and Sukartarini. The print reports that according to DU sources, the three texts have been removed due to their gruesome sexual content and portrayal of the Indian military in poor light, end quote. And in response to the removal of the works of Devi Bama and Sukhartarani, over 1,000 Indian academics, artists, authors, and Dalit rights organizations circulated a petition demanding that these works be reinstated at Delhi University. The petition points out, and I'm quoting here, the deleted texts are seminally important as they help realize the systematic oppression of Dalit and Adivasi communities. And on Devi's short story, the petition states, and I'm quoting again, this work shows that poverty is a socially constructed state and thus open to transformation. Draupadi is also a woman. She is the namesake of an epic protagonist who is disrobed in the presence of all her kinsmen during a game of dice. The Draupadis across centuries help splinter the Sabha, the family or state, as not quite the promised safe haven for women, not yet. So that is what the petition said about this short story. The penultimate Mahabharata that I want to discuss today is Doordarshan Kisan's 2016 Hindi television serial, Draupadi. Doordarshan Kisan is one of the multiple different national channels of Doordarshan, the national television network of India. The target audience of Doordarshan Kisan is presumably farmers in India, hence the name Kisan or farmer. Now, one of the most popular post-independence Mahabharatas is undoubtedly the Hindi Mahabharata television serial that was broadcast on Doordarshan from 1988 to 1990. As with Doordarshan's original Mahabharata television show, Doordarshan Kisan's Draupadi presents the heroine of the epic praying to Krishna during her attempted disrobing. In a marked departure from the earlier iconic Hindi serial, however, Krishna does not appear in the corner of the screen with saris flowing from his hands, as he does in the Hindi serial, the original Doordarshan serial. And in the more recent show, when Draupadi closes her eyes and begins to chant Krishna's name, we see all the women of the Kuru clan who have been watching the dice game from a balcony in the assembly hall close their eyes as well. Then, for a fleeting second, images of Krishna appear over the hearts of these royal women. When Dushasana begins to pull at Draupadi's sari, Duryodhana's wife Bhanumati, the Kaurava's mother Gandhari, the Kuru matriarch Satyavati, and all of the Kaurava women pull off their own dupattas and saris and fling them over the balcony to Draupadi, who uses them to cover herself. When the Kaurava women run out of saris and are left standing only in their petticoats and blouses, Bhanumati runs to her bedroom and grabs a yellow sari that Krishna had given her as a wedding gift in a previous episode. Bhanumati throws the sari over the balcony, and the sight of Draupadi draped in this garment in Krishna's signature color deters Dushasana from trying to disrobe her further. While the words Radhe Krishna, Gopala Krishna, or Radha's Krishna, Gopala Krishna are chanted repeatedly in the background during the sequence, the audience of the serial cannot help but ask if it is Krishna who has saved Draupadi, or is it the combined effort of all the Kaurava women? Are the creators of this Draupadi serial presenting the scene as an example of Draupadi's bhakti for Krishna, or as an example of women coming together to protect each other from sexual assault?
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
I'm so sorry. I think my Apple phone started talking to me. I'm so sorry. Krishna is also noticeably absent from a recent political cartoon depicting Draupadi's disrobing that was shared over 2,000 times on Twitter in March of this year. The caption of this political cartoon is by an account called Pen, Pencil, Draw, and the caption is "Your Honor." The artist of this political cartoon is clearly inspired by the presentation of this scene in Doordarshan's original Mahabharata television show. Draupadi is wearing a yellow sari that mirrors the one her counterpart wears in the original Doordarshan serial, and Dushasana is sporting the same gaudy giant golden crown that he wears in Doordarshan's Mahabharata. Although this episode first aired over 30 years ago in 1989, the show was rebroadcast during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. 22.9 million viewers watched the finale of the show on Doordarshan Bharati network during the pandemic. Thus, it is not surprising that the artist of this political cartoon draws inspiration from Doordarshan's Mahabharata. Yet while Draupadi's hands are joined in prayer in this political cartoon as Dushasana tugs at her sari, Krishna is nowhere to be seen. Instead, in the upper right corner of the political cartoon, we see a judge in black robes sitting on a raised bench with a gavel asking Dushasana, "So will you marry her?" This political cartoon is a response to the comments of a member of the Indian Supreme Court. In the beginning of March this year, thousands of people in India demanded that the Chief Justice resign after he told a man who raped a 16-year-old girl, "If you want to marry her, we can help you. If not, you lose your job and go to jail." So the survivor and her family had initially not gone to the police because the rapist's mother had promised that her son would marry the survivor. The rapist, however, married someone else. The survivor went to the police, and they appeared before the Chief Justice. This political cartoon brings up several important questions. Draupadi is clearly praying in this political cartoon, but who is she praying to? Is Krishna choosing not to answer Draupadi's plea? Is Krishna supposed to be the Chief Justice? Is having survivors marry their attackers the only way to save modern Draupadis in India today? There are so many other Mahabharatas that I wish I could have discussed at length in this presentation, including the stunning and controversial lithograph of Draupadi by the renowned artist M.F. Hussain. But I hope that the depictions of Draupadi in the 12 Mahabharatas that I have spoken about today have shown just how remarkably diverse the Mahabharata tradition is just within South Asia. I haven't even talked about Southeast Asia or the diaspora, right? Just within South Asia. Although her prayer to Krishna is absent from the critical edition of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, Draupadi's plea to the deity has become one of the most beloved displays of Hindu Vaishnava bhakti in the Mahabharata tradition. While the Jain poet Pampa omits the disrobing in Draupadi's prayer, the creators of the Mughal Razamnama retain Krishna's divine intervention in this episode. The brutal assault Draupadi suffers at the hands of Dushasana has been used as an allegory for the anti-colonial struggle in the early 20th century, as well as an allegory for the sexual violence that Adivasi women face every day in contemporary India. During the past 2,000 years, countless Mahabharatas have emerged from South Asia. Their creators include women, Hindus, Jains, Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis, and members of low-caste Dalit and Adivasi communities. I believe that in the years to come, we can expect to see many more new retellings that address salient social, religious, social and political issues. And these issues that impact the audiences and the creators of these modern Mahabharatas. These new Mahabharatas will certainly deserve our continued attention. And I'll stop there. Thank you. And I'm looking forward to the discussion and to answering any questions you may have.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pillai, for that wonderful presentation. And it is exciting to see these different narratives of Mahabharata existing. And, we have made our mind that there is a hierarchy and only the Sanskrit classical Mahabharata is the one prevalent narrative, but we tend to ignore the local traditions, the vernacular versions of Mahabharata, which are independent to themselves. They exist in a different parallel world. They do not have anything to do with the original, with the if we call it original Sanskrit text. And the character that you chose for this presentation, Draupadi, is the single most important character in the whole story, because many now raise questions on the feminine, or the how female is represented in the epic, or how the domination of male is uh, is shown in the epic. So questions are raised around even the polyandry of Draupadi is there, and which might be absent in other versions of Mahabharata. And also, if we have to see a question that I would like to ask you is about Krishna and the question of dharma in different narrative traditions of Mahabharata, because we see Krishna preaching the Gita in Mahabharata, the classical Mahabharata. So how do you see that, the preaching of the dharma in different narrative traditions?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question, Ishan. Let me just start with, even in the Sanskrit Mahabharata itself, dharma is an immensely complex concept, right? So we have Krishna, who on one hand is, a reincarnation of Narayana. He is God on earth, and he is, supposedly there to uphold dharma. But then in the Mahabharata, we see him encouraging characters all the time to act against dharma, right? Prime examples are with, the slaying of Drona, the teacher of the Pandavas and the Kauravas, when Krishna encourages Yudhishthira to lie to Drona and to say that Yudhishthira has, that Ashwatthama, Drona's son, has died. We also see, with Duryodhana and certain tellings when Krishna is, hitting his thigh to show Bhima that the way to kill Drona is to strike below the waist, of course, but that is also a dharma that is going against the laws of war. So even in the Mahabharata, the question of dharma is very complex. And ironically, one character who talks about dharma a lot and asks if characters are upholding dharma is Draupadi. In the disrobing scene, before the attempted disrobing, she asks the Kuru elders, is this dharma? Is this correct, what Yudhishthira has done? She has this famous question, who did he lose first? Did Yudhishthira lose me or himself first, right? And if he lost himself, what right does he have to gamble me? So even within the Sanskrit Mahabharata, this is an immensely complex question, and I'd encourage any viewers who are interested in this question to look at Emily Hudson's wonderful book, Disorienting Dharma, which is available from Oxford University Press. And it's interesting, when you see different retellings of the Mahabharata, often we see Krishna still acting in these kind of devious ways. I'll just give a few examples from the Tamil Mahabharata I work with, Billy's Tamil Bharatam, which is from the 15th century. It's even more devious sometimes the way that Krishna acts. So we have an example where before the war, in the 5th book of the text, the Idyoga Parvan in the Sanskrit Mahabharata, the book of preparation or the book of effort, where Krishna is meeting Ashwatthama, who is the son of Drona and an ally of the Kauravas, and he drops a ring so that it looks like Ashwatthama is going to touch Krishna's feet. And Duryodhana sees this, and he immediately is distrustful of Ashwatthama because he thinks that he's, his friend, his ally is touching Krishna's feet, and that he's actually going to be, fighting on the side of the Pandavas or something like that. And, there's just so many little episodes like this in the Tamil Mahabharata, Billy's Bharatam, where Krishna is even more, Alf Hiltebeitel, a great scholar of Sanskrit Mahabharata, has this quote in which he calls Krishna the ringmaster of the Kurukshetra war because he's, directing everyone. But in Billy's Tamil Bharatam, Krishna is more like the puppet master. He's pulling everyone's strings to get exactly what kind of actions he wants. And then I think, in some of these modern Mahabharatas, like Mahasweta Devi's short story, I think we're not supposed to see Dharma anywhere. It's a text, it's a story in which Dharma is completely being violated. Women are being violated. And I think it's very conscious in some narratives like that. Again, there's so many different Mahabharatas, it's hard to say whether there's Dharma in all of them or not, or how much it's treated. Of course, Dharma is at the heart of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, and I think it's a very important concept in many retellings, but the way these retellings play with the concept of Dharma depend entirely on the context of the text or the movie or the comic book or whatever format the Mahabharata is in.
And this makes me wonder about the Shanti Parvana also, because it is the question of morality when Yudhishthira is faced with what to choose and what not to choose, and whether he wants to, go to monkhood or he wants to take up the ruler life. How do you see that part of the story in different retellings?
So it's so interesting, Ishan. The Shanti Parvan is one of the longest books of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, and I'm most familiar with vernacular regional retellings. And I have to tell you, most pre-modern regional Mahabharata retellings actually end with the end of the war. They only have 10 books. So this is true of Kumara Vyasa's Kannada Karnata Bharata Katha Manjari, which was composed in the 15th century. It's true of Villi's 15th century Tamil Bharatam. It's also true of the earliest extant Bhasha or Old Hindi Mahabharata, which was by a poet named Vishnu Das, and he was active in Gwalior. And so all of these, and there are many other, regional retellings of the Mahabharata that are composed in the, early modern period that end with the war. So we don't see Yudhishthira go through this crisis of what should he do after he's caused all the suffering. We don't see, episodes that are very popular in people's minds in which, the one in which Krishna puts an iron statue of Bhima in front of Dhritarashtra, and Dhritarashtra, squeezes it and it breaks. We don't see the death of Krishna, which happens in the Sanskrit Mahabharata, right? And in a way, this is quite similar to many regional retellings of the Ramayana, which end right after Rama returns to Ayodhya. We don't have this part of the Sanskrit Ramayana in which, Sita is exiled again, a pregnant Sita, and she goes to the forest. She gives birth to Lava and Kush, living in the ashram of Valmiki. And so many region, and it's also true of, the television Hindi Mahabharata, right? I think it ends actually with the Pandavas going to see Bhishma on the bed of arrows, but it doesn't really go into those later 8 books of the Mahabharata. It is in Chauhan's Mahabharata, which I work on, but it's all about Krishna. All of the philosophical advice Bhishma is giving is to worship Krishna or to recite the name of Ram. And so it's all kind of bhaktified in my text. So it's very interesting. We don't really see it a lot in these regional retellings so much.
We have a lot of questions for you in the chat, and I'll read those out now. This is by Shivam Verma. His question is, when you are saying, when you're using Bhasha or Old Hindi, will you also consider the Avadi work Tulsidas Ramcharitmanas in the same category of Bhasha?
Yeah,
Old Hindi
that's such an excellent question. And it's a very conscious decision for me to use the term Bhasha. So many of my fellow pre-modern Hindi scholars, use terms like Braj Bhasha and Avadi when they're taught. So, Surdas, we consider a Braj Bhasha poet, Tulsidas as an Avadi poet. But the reason why I use the term Bhasha is because the poets themselves weren't using these terms Avadi and Braj Bhasha, right? They were using the term Bhasha because they were making a distinction in that we're not composing in Sanskrit. We're composing in, our mother tongue, in the vernacular, in Bhasha. Another term that was used was Hindavi, but this is mostly in Persian sources talking about the language that what we call now Hindi, these pre-modern dialects of Hindi. And so, scholars like the late Aditya Bell, he would use the term Hindavi. Francesco Orsini often uses the term Hindavi. But we're now seeing some other scholars such as Tyler Williams at UChicago, Gregory Kleins at Trinity University, using the term Bhasha. And I like to use the term Bhasha because Tulsidas himself uses the term Bhasha. We also have the authors of the Sufi Premakyans, the Prem Kathas, also using the term Bhasha. So Jayasi, who wrote Padmavat, and he also wrote a retelling of Krishna's life, the Kanhavat, which is a fascinating text. He said he uses Bhasha, Bakau. Vishnu Das, this poet I was talking about earlier, who wrote the first extant Old Hindi Mahabharata, also uses the word Bhasha. So that's why I use it. Though, of course, many scholars do refer to it by these dialects of Braj Bhasha and Avadi. But then it gets complicated, when we look at someone like Tulsidas, who is primarily composing in Avadi, but then he has compositions which we call Braj Bhasha compositions, like the Kavitavali. And was Tulsidas aware that he's writing in 2 different dialects? Does he see it as different? It's a really fascinating question. So that's why I like to use the term Bhasha.
Thank you so much for that. We have a question by Ravi Prakash. His question is on Buddhist Mahabharata traditions. If there is any, if you can talk about the Buddhist Mahabharata tradition, that like we have Dasharatha Ramayana, Dasharatha Jataka. So do we have any Buddhist tradition of this great epic?
That is an excellent question. And let me first say, I'm actually not aware of any Buddhist retellings of the Mahabharata. As Ishani pointed out, we do have the Dasharatha Jataka, and Ramila Thapar has written a lot about these Buddhist Ramayana retellings that might be almost as old as Valmiki's Sanskrit Ramayana. And these Buddhist Ramayanas are fascinating. In some of them, Rama and Sita are siblings. And there's no Ravana character. It's all about the internal conflict between brothers and ascension to the throne, which is so fascinating. But what I will say is that many Sanskrit scholars see the Bhagavad-Gita in the Sanskrit Mahabharata as a response to the rise of Buddhist and Jain religious traditions, right? It's this whole text in which Krishna is telling Arjuna, come on, be a man, basically, don't be a eunuch, essentially is what he says in the text. Come on and kill your family members. it's kind of all against this idea of ahimsa, which we would have seen rising around this time with Buddhist and Jain tradition. So many scholars do see the Bhagavad-Gita as a response to the Buddhist tradition, but I'm actually not aware of any kind of Buddhist retellings of the Mahabharata, similar to this, I talked about this really rich Jain tradition of retelling the Mahabharata, but I'm not aware of any Buddhist ones. And if any of you know about any of them, I would love to learn more.
Hassan Jha, Dr. Jha asks that, can you talk about Draupadi described in different European languages?
Oh, that's a really great question. Draupadi in different European questions. Thank you, Dr. Jha. I will say that some of my favorite retellings of the Mahabharata were originally composed in English. One was Chitra Banerjee Divakurni's The Palace of Illusions, which is a retelling of the Mahabharata through Draupadi's perspective. There is a beautiful new set of poetry called Until the Lions, which is these short stories, short poems from the Mahabharata, focusing on different characters. We don't actually see Draupadi's voice in them, but I would highly recommend Until the Lions for anyone who's interested, by Karthika Nair. We hear Amba's voice, Gandhari's voice. We hear the voice of the dog who accompanies the Pandavas to heaven, foot soldiers. Other European, and of course, there is Peter Brook's very famous Mahabharata play, which was originally composed in French. And it's a very interesting play. I think the whole thing is on YouTube. Well, the whole thing is actually 9 hours long. I think there's a condensed version on YouTube that's 5 hours long. And it has a very international cast, which could be seen as a bit controversial. All of the demonic characters and the stronger characters like Bhima are played by actors of African descent, where Drona is played by a Japanese actor. But the only South Asian actor in the whole production is the actress who plays Draupadi, Malika Sarabhai. And so that was originally composed in French. I know there are Mahabharatas composed in multiple European languages. Unfortunately, I don't know about many of them. I really only know English and a bit of Spanish I learned in high school, but I would be so interested again in learning more. Again, this just shows that there are so many Mahabharatas, and it's impossible to know about all of them, but I'm always delighted to learn about different retellings and different versions.
Ayushman Chakrabarti says that Krishna is like okay, we'll skip that comment. We'll go to Sukhdev. His question is, please comment on the evolution of the title Mahabharata of a regional epic. Do we have any other name of this epic before Mahabharata?
So that's very interesting. Within the Sanskrit Mahabharata itself, there is a set of 20,000 verses. So first, let me say, the Sanskrit Mahabharata itself, even the critical edition, says that it is comprised of around 100,000 verses, right? Which is the longest poem in the world, 15 times the length of the Bible, right? But I think the critical edition is something around 75,000 verses. Again, the creators of the critical edition were going through manuscripts and trying to keep the parts of the text that they found in multiple major manuscripts. But within either these 75,000 verses or these 100,000 verses, there is a 20,000 verse section called Jaya, or victory, of the Mahabharata, and it has that name, and the Sanskrit Mahabharata says it itself. It's very interesting with regional retellings of the Mahabharata, and the names they pick for retellings, right? So the two I work on, Chauhan's Mahabharata, obviously retaining the name. The Tamil text Bharatam is Bharata. It's a Tamilification of the Sanskrit word Bharata. But the Jain Mahabharata I talked about today, the Vikram Arjuna Vijayam, right? That's the victory of heroic Arjuna. And again, like I said, in this Jain text, Arjuna is the main character. But in the 11th century, just 100 years after this, we have another Kannada Mahabharata, again patronized by a member of the Chalukya Empire, by another Jain poet, or he may or may not have been Jain. I would suggest you read the work of Timothy Lorndale, who's written quite a bit about this poet. His name is Rana, and his Mahabharata is called the Sahasa Bhima Vijayam, which is the victory of bold Bhima. And this is a Mahabharata telling in which Bhima is the main character. In the 15th century, we also have, I mentioned before, Vishnudas's Bandav Charit, which translates as the deeds, the charita of the Pandavas. And so not all regional retellings keep the word Mahabharata in their title. And I think it's very telling whether they choose to retain that or not. Often it can refer to the contents of the poem, right? In both these two Kannada texts I talked about, we have one of the Pandava brothers being the main heroes. And it's interesting in Vishnudas's Pandav Charit in Bhasha, Bhima is also clearly the hero of that text, but it still has the name Pandav Charit. And so it's very interesting to see what kind of, new titles we get. Shashi Tharoor has been on this channel before, and he wrote a Mahabharata telling called The Great Indian Novel, playing with the fact that Maha, Great Bharata, India, Great Indian Novel. So it's really interesting to see what different retellers of the Mahabharata do with this title.
This is a question by Krishnakant Lahangir, and he asked that Sarla Das's 15th century Odia Mahabharata provides an alternative reading of Vyasa's canonical text with many surprising elements. What is your opinion on this?
I deeply wish I could read and write Oriya, because Sarla Das's Mahabharata is just such an interesting text. I heard some really fascinating talks about Sarla Das's Mahabharata at a conference I went to in Tirur in Kerala, which was the home of the Malayalam first Adi Kavi of the Mahabharata. And, Sarla Das's Mahabharata has all of these really fascinating stories. I think one of my favorite, and the reason why this is my favorite is because it's a story we also find in Kannada. We also find it in Tamil. I think we find it even in some Hindi retellings of the Mahabharata. It's definitely in modern Marathi tellings, in which there's a story when the Pandavas are all in exile in the forest, and they come across a tree with a fruit, and they pluck it and they are about to eat it, and they find out that this tree belongs to a sage who gets very angry when people take things from him. And the only way that the fruit can be reattached to the tree, and they learn this because they call on Krishna and Krishna comes, is if they share the deepest truth that they've been hiding from themselves. And so they all go around and they say these truths. And Draupadi's truth in many of these retellings is that she secretly loves Karna, the secret Pandava brother. And when they each reveal this truth, the fruit just comes a little bit closer to reaching the top. But Sarla Das's Mahabharata has so many interesting different elements. The Ramayana is an important part of Sarla Das's Mahabharata as well. There's some articles about this by William Smith. And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, I hope someone will, I believe that Sarla Das's Mahabharata might be even longer than the Sanskrit Mahabharata. It's a very long text with all of these interesting new retellings and elements. There's another story in which Kunti and Gandhari are competing about who can worship Shiva, and their sons have to do these different competitions. And it's such a really interesting text. And also it is a text in which we see Krishna kind of in his important role as the main deity in Puri, right? That kind of literary and religious affiliations with Krishna we see, but we also, I think, see Krishna acting very deviously in the Oriya Mahabharata. Again, all of these comments are based on scholarship in English that I've read. Again, I really wish I could read Oriya, but it seems like such a fascinating retelling. And I think, Sarla Das is also kind of revered as the Adi Kavi of Oriya. It's just so interesting. So many regional Mahabharata retellings are considered the first work of literature in their regional languages. So Pampa is called the Adi Kavi of Kannada with his text. Sarla Dasa. In Telugu, we have Nannaya there are three poets who wrote the Telugu Mahabharatamu, but Nannaya in the 11th century was the first of these three poets. And so it's so interesting that the Adi Kavya in Oriya, Telugu, Kannada is a Mahabharata retelling.
Take three more questions because we are approaching our time limit.
Okay.
We have about 10 more minutes. This is a question by Ravi Prakash. His question is, can you also speak about the distinctive influence of courtly literary cultures on some of the Mahabharata traditions in early modern period, like the Riti influence on Mahabharata composition?
Thank you so much for asking this question. As I mentioned twice in this talk, the book project which I'm working on right now is called Krishna at Court, Devotion, Patronage, and the Mahabharata in pre-modern South Asia. And I'm still working on it, but it's so fascinating. So one of the great scholars of Sanskrit literature in the US, Sheldon Pollock, who's at Columbia University, has noted that many of the first regional Mahabharatas were composed in courtly settings. So, Pampa is a Jain poet, but his patron is a Hindu emperor, the Chalukya emperor. So that's in a court setting. Vishnu Das is at the court of Dungarendra Singh in Gwalior. And there's a story in his text where he talks about the king, throwing a betel leaf, which is a kind of like challenge, and saying, how did 5 Pandavas defeat 100 Kauravas? And then Vishnu Das begins his retelling. And the 2 texts I work on, Billy's Tamil Mahabharatam, Sabal Singh Chauhan, so interestingly, is praising Aurangzeb throughout his text. There are many Hindi and Bhasha texts dedicated to a Mughal emperor, but you usually find that dedication in the beginning of the text, unless you're writing like a prasasti, like, Keshav Das's work for Jahangir. But if it's a narrative poem, usually just praise the Mughal emperor or whichever king in the beginning, and you're done. But Chauhan praises Aurangzeb throughout his text, which is so fascinating. I do have to say, and I was a student of the late Alison Bush, who was at Columbia University and an incredible scholar of Rithi literature. And I talked about this with her. Chauhan's Mahabharata doesn't really show any influence of this kind of Rithi, courtly literary style. It's much more simple, it's not simple, similar to Tulsidas in that respect and kind of his narrative style, at least within the Ramcharitmanas. There's other texts, I think, where Tulsidas is, really showing like alliteration and other very complex poetic and literary features. But it's not, I wouldn't compare Chauhan's Mahabharata to say Keshav Das's Ramchandra Chandrika, which is a Bhasha Mahakavya. Right? It's this really courtly literary text. But Vili's Tamil Bharatam is 100% a Tamil Perunkapyam or a Mahakavya. And in my book, I actually argue that Vili is claiming the Tamil Mahakavya, the Perunkapyam genre for Sri Vaishnavas, because we have, at the same time, we have the Perya Puranam, which is this great narrative, it's a hagiographical narrative about Shiva. So we have a Shaiva kind of Perunkapyam, Mahakavya style. In the 9th century, there was a wonderful Jain text, the Sivan Kasantamani, which my dear friend Morgan Curtis is currently working on at Harvard. And it's another Jain Mahakavya in Tamil. And then there's Kamban, and some people call Kamban a Bhakti poet. But another late mentor of mine, the fantastic Anne Monius, really persuasively argued that Kamban might have been a Shaiva poet. We find Shiva's name more than Rama's in the Iramavataram, in Kamban's poem. And so we have these other Tamil poems. We have the Perya Puranam, we have the Iramavataram, we have the Sivakasantamani. And I think Vili, who I hope I've showed today, is a clear Sri Vaishnava poet trying to claim the Tamil Mahakavya genre for the Sri Vaishnava Hindu religious community. Sorry, I just got very excited about that. That's what I work on, and I talked a bit, sorry.
Okay, now we have a question that I have been waiting for, because it's one of the most common questions that we get when we talk about the epics.
Yeah.
Which is the older epic, Ramayana or Mahabharata? Asked Deepika Paul.
Great question.
Deepika, sorry. Yeah.
It's an excellent question. So in the narrative progression we think of, right? We think of Rama coming before Krishna, right? Because of the 10 incarnations of Vishnu. And we think that the Mahabharata, and the Mahabharata is set in a different yuga than the Ramayana, right? It's the beginning of the Kali Yuga. But many Sanskrit scholars believe that the Mahabharata was written before the Ramayana. The Mahabharata, very interestingly, contains its own version of the Ramayana, right? The Sanskrit Mahabharata, the Rama Upakhana, the Upakhana of Rama, which is in the 4th book of the Sanskrit Mahabharata. It's a very interesting, and it's a pretty lengthy retelling of the Ramayana, but a retelling in which we do not see the Agni Pariksha of Sita. I've been calling it a retelling. Maybe it's not a retelling. Maybe that came before Valmiki's Ramayana. I think many Sanskrit scholars believe that the Mahabharata was written before the Ramayana. I'm actually not a scholar of Sanskrit literature, so I don't want to make a definite statement about it. But I think if you look at a lot of the introductions to these new Sanskrit, English retellings, translations, of the Sanskrit Mahabharata, most scholars say that the Mahabharata was written first, but and you can see the historical evidence they suggest for that. But what I find really interesting is that the Mahabharata has a Ramayana within it.
Yeah, I think those were the questions. And thank you so much, Dr. Pillai, for giving this lecture, because it really has sparked the interest in all of us to go and look out for those various versions of Ramayana that you talked about and the Mahabharata that you talked about, and maybe find more and more in local traditions, because not just in oral tradition, but also in performative traditions, like, the Draupadi Amman tradition in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, the other parts of South India and other parts, Draupadi is represented in various,
Yeah,
forms.
she's a goddess in Tamil Nadu. It's
Yeah.
fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah, so it's fascinating because when we are calling it a tradition, as your title mentioned, the Mahabharata tradition, we have to understand that tradition cannot exist in just one form. It
Exactly.
takes different forms, and it travels throughout the territorial boundaries, or even beyond that, in different countries, as you mentioned. And we must not make it like a hierarchical thing that, Sanskrit is the only dominant narrative, but there are various narratives that we must accept, and we must read those stories as well, and we must look for that. Thank you so much for this, and thank you so much everybody for joining us in such a big number, and we still have a lot of people watching us. So a small request: if you like today's session, you can leave a comment, like the video, share with your friends on social media, and there is a beautiful red button just below this video called subscribe. You can click on that to subscribe to the channel if you want, because we try to do more sessions like these on a regular basis for the last 2 years, and we plan to continue it for a very long time. So we really need your support. So to support us, you can subscribe, you can like, and you can share. That is what you can do. It doesn't cost anything, just a second or two. Thank you so much, everyone. We'll meet again with another session. You can look out on our Instagram and different social media pages to get notifications of all the sessions that we do. And happy Sunday to all. It's Sunday night. All are preparing for offices, so all the best for the next week. We'll meet again next week. Thank you so much.